brand takes lots of ingredients into account when ranking the world's most valuable brands. To even qualify for the list, each brand must derive about a third of its earnings outside of the home country. It must be recognizable outside of the base of customers that it relies on and have publicly available marketing and financial data. The results of the best global brands were announced in New York last night. Joining us now is Jeremy Sampson of Interbrand Sampson South Africa. Just talk to us about the top 100 global brands. We can't go through 100 global brands on Business AM, but we can talk about the top 10. Which ones are they?
I think the top 10, not much change at the very top. Coca Cola is still there, but IBM has moved up from 3 to 2, deposing Microsoft. And then you have General Electric, you have Nokia, McDonald's is going incredibly strongly, and then Google, and then you go through to finally Disney.
Okay.
But they're very strong.
Okay, so out of 10, you've got 3 computer and ICT players. What does that tell us?
It tells us that the IT section is growing all the time. Obviously, the biggest losers this year has been banking by a long way, but IT is coming up. We're all using our cell phones, that sort of thing, and we're using computers. That's the society of today.
Okay, what does this tell us about the social consciousness of these brands?
I think we all want to associate with brands which are socially acceptable, but which make our lives easier. I think the biggest premium we all have is on our time, and anything that's going to speed up the use of our time is going to help us. And that's where our cell phone more and more is becoming our computer as well.
Okay, now, recurring brands are Coca Cola and Google. Over the last few years, they continue to dominate the space. Why is that?
It's because you and I need them. You know, Coca Cola is something very affordable. It's not a luxury brand, so the communities around the world, and Coca Cola is all around the world, can afford that. In some countries, if you're very poor, it might be a treat, but other people will take it as a matter of course. Likewise with Google. Google is the youngest brand in the top 10. It's only 11 years old this year, but it's become the must-have. Any of us, if we want to find out anything now, could just Google it, and there it is.
Just talk to us about the Coca Cola phenomenon. For years, it dominates social consciousness in terms of everybody knows what a Coca Cola is. I remember being in a very remote part of what was then Zaire, and the one thing I could access was a Coca Cola, if nothing else. How did Coca Cola do it?
I think it was after World War II that Coca Cola basically, or actually during World War II, that it was part of the rations for the US soldiers in World War II, and therefore it spread around the world. I mean, wherever the US went, it went along with them, and therefore became part of the world economy. And if you look at it a couple of years ago, I think it was a couple of decades ago, Coke tried to actually change from Coke to New Coke, and that turned out to be one of the biggest disasters in marketing history. Actually, it was turned around by bringing back old Coke, and then sales just went up, and they just took over from Pepsi, who just for a small period of time was #1.
Okay, who are the biggest losers?
Biggest losers, when you look through, are the banks, which is no surprise.
Yeah.
And when you actually look at the decliners, the Morgan Stanleys, the American Expresses, through to UBS and Citibank. But one of the 5 is Harley Davidson, which is going to upset a lot of people. But it's because it isn't a brand you have to have.
Yeah.
It's a luxury brand. If you've got some spare money, if a man wants a toy and he's very wealthy, he'll get a Harley. But this is where strong brands will go down in recessionary times in some areas, and they'll come up when the good times return.
Okay, it's not a surprise that the banks have taken a knock. Because at the moment, with so many people having lost their investments, their pensions, there's a credibility crisis here when it comes to banking and investment bankers as a constituency. What do they need to do to revive some sort of appeal?
Yes, I think bankers are up there with lawyers at the moment in the US. And in terms of basically people are talking about the bailout money and all the fact that they take the bailout money, then they make huge profits afterwards and still take huge bonuses. I don't think there's anything the bankers can do that they will do to actually improve their image. The reason being is that one thing that they should be doing is actually reducing bonuses, reducing basically the huge profits that they're making. But as a business or as employees of these banks, I don't think either of these things will be viable in the future.
Oh, well, the situation with the banks and the bankers is peculiar to what's happened in the last 365 days. But generally, for a brand that's taken a knock, be it because of a recession or because they've lost brand equity, what do you do to revive it? And here, let's talk about those luxury brands like a Harley Davidson.
I think you and I want things, especially in these recessionary times when times are tighter, that we can trust. We want a trust mark. We want banks that we can trust. We want products. We want luxuries. If we're going to splash out, we want to know that what we're spending money on is good value and is going to deliver on us. We talk about a brand being a promise made and a promise kept. And that's where, especially in these times, people need to keep their promises more. They can be trusted and they need to be more transparent.
Okay, let's talk about top brands and new markets, because this was launched in New York. Yes, this is the consumer base of the global economy, but you've got the Chinas, the Indias coming to the fore, and there people are wearing Louis Vuitton, carrying Gucci handbags, driving Mercedes-Benz.
It's a very good question. We had a conference call on Tuesday with all our offices around the world, and there are nearly 40. And one of the big things was that of the top 100 brands, 51 are American, and that's been coming down. But as you see, the balance of power almost is switching to the east. Whilst there aren't any major Chinese brands, the Chinese community, the Indian community now are spending more and more money on global brands and developing their own. And in the Indians' case, often acquiring global brands, which now they're using around the world. Okay,
we're beginning within the automotive sector, we're beginning to see Tata from India, Geely from China, and although they're not high-end trustworthy brands, they're gaining a lot of impetus, and it was said yesterday in a news report from a rival network that as the growth of these economies starts to resonate globally, and we're starting to see more exports of these cars coming out of Asia, it will just start to assume a place, especially when you're seeing mergers and acquisitions in terms of Jaguar, for instance, and Tata.
Oh, yes, most certainly. If you look, I remember there's an old movie called Back to the Future, and in that, a guy travels back into the past, and the people say, oh, it's a Japanese-made vehicle, or a Japanese-made part or something, and it must be junk. And that was the impression that we had of the Japanese, say, 50, 60 years ago, and the impression we have of the Chinese right now. But if you look at the world economy right now, you would say best made cars in the world are the Japanese, you know, the Hondas, the Toyotas, etc. And that's probably going to happen with the Chinese as well. They're going through a phrase that everyone says the Chinese qualities are garbage, which they probably are because they're fighting on cost at the moment.
Right.
But in the future, we would expect them to come up as the Koreas have come up with Hyundai,
right,
as the Japanese have come up with Toyota and Honda. And they will probably be the dominant car makers in 50 years' time. Your kids will say, I would never buy a Jaguar. I'd rather buy a Geely any day of the week.
Okay, that's an interesting one. And he keeps on saying Toyota, which is also featuring as one of the top 100 brands. How did they get to this position?
Toyota has been consistently good. As we've heard, they started adding on things and then not charging extras. And they're consistent and they deliver. They're also conscious of the environment. They've tried to produce greener cars, as it were. And that's an important part of Toyota. But it's this consistency of delivery, right, always trying to woo us.
Jeremy, the context has definitely changed. We're coming out of a global recession. We're seeing new shifts to the east in terms of new centers of economic power. We're seeing a change in consciousness and an awareness of the environment, and people just disgusted by issues such as corporate greed. What do marketers of these, marketers of all companies, not necessarily the top 100 brands, need to be aware of in terms of gearing their brands to a changing social and political landscape?
You've got to keep resonating with your consumer. You've got to keep that contact. In this country, it's particularly difficult with 50% of the population so young. So you've got to connect at a young age. But you've got to keep building that trust, maintaining that trust. A brand is like a friend you've had from school or whatever, who is still a friend of yours. You want to maintain that momentum, maintain the values, and you adjust as you go through different ages perhaps, but you keep that relationship. That's crucial.